Lee Miller didn't become famous the way most people do by chasing the spotlight. She became famous by walking straight into danger, then pointing a camera at it, and refusing to blink. One year she was the face of high fashion, the kind of woman strangers stared at like a dream. A few years later, she was standing in the ruins of Europe with mud on her boots, photographing bodies, smoke, and shattered cities, capturing the kind of truth polite society begged to ignore. Her life reads like a contradiction you can't solve. Model and war correspondent, muse and maker, glamorous and haunted. And the most unsettling part is this: she didn't just witness history. She absorbed it, until it started to tear her apart from the inside. She was born Elizabeth Lee Miller on April 23, 1907, in a small American town that looked peaceful from the outside, tree-lined streets, familiar faces, the kind of place where everyone knows your family. But inside her home, the energy was different. Her father, Theodore, was not an ordinary man. He was inventive, analytical, fascinated by modernity, someone who treated the world like a puzzle meant to be solved. He filled their lives with new comforts before most families even dreamed of them. Electricity, running water, a sense that the future could be built, not waited for. More importantly, he made his daughter feel seen. He taught her unusual things: how to observe, how to think critically, how to hold two ideas at once without needing to choose. And when he placed a camera in her hands, it wasn't just a gift. It was a doorway. Because Lee didn't look at the camera the way most people do. She didn't see a hobby. She saw control. She saw a way to decide what the world would remember. But childhood is rarely only one thing. Even the brightest homes can have dark corners. Something happened to Lee when she was very young, something violent and deeply damaging. It left scars she carried for the rest of her life, not always visible, but present in the way she moved through the world. Restless, defiant, sometimes reckless, as if calmness was a luxury she couldn't afford. The adults around her tried to fix what couldn't be neatly fixed. Treatments. Silence. A careful attempt to move on. But Lee didn't move on. She transformed. After that, her personality became a storm. She could be brilliant and impossible in the same hour. Explosive one moment, charming the next. Her emotions didn't arrive politely, they arrived like weather, sudden and overwhelming. School couldn't hold her. Rules irritated her. Discipline felt like a cage. And beneath the mischief and rebellion, there was a deeper truth. Lee seemed determined to prove that nothing, not trauma, not society, not anyone's expectations, would ever control her again. She grew into the roaring 20s like she was born for it. Hair cut short. Clothes that blurred the lines between feminine and masculine. A posture that said, "I belong wherever I decide to stand." She wasn't trying to be liked. She was trying to be free. At 19, she went to Europe, and the moment she stepped into Paris, she felt something click into place. Paris wasn't just a city. It was permission. It was art spilling into streets, ideas arguing in cafes, people reinventing themselves without asking for approval. Lee looked around and didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like an owner of her own life for the first time. But her first taste of Paris also revealed something about her nature. She was drawn to the edge of things. To risk. To intensity. Even her earliest experiences there carried a strange blend of innocence and boldness, like she was chasing sensation because sensation made her feel real. And when she returned to America, the contrast was unbearable. Home felt smaller. The air felt heavier. She fell into a depression so deep it was like mourning a life she had tasted and lost. So she did what she would do again and again throughout her story. She ran toward the place that made her feel alive. New York. New York in the late 1920s was electric. The city moved fast and demanded confidence, and Lee had that in abundance, or at least she wore it like armor. She stepped into the world of fashion, theater, nightlife, and ambition. She was beautiful in a way that didn't feel soft. It felt sharp. She wasn't the kind of beauty that begged for protection. She was the kind that made people nervous. Then fate intervened in the most cinematic way possible. One day, on a New York street, Lee nearly stepped into traffic. At the last second, a stranger grabbed her and pulled her back. That stranger wasn't just anyone. He was Condé Nast, the man behind Vogue, a figure whose approval could turn a face into an era. He looked at Lee and saw something that belonged on the cover of modernity. Within months, she was on Vogue. And overnight, Lee Miller became a sensation. Photographers wanted her. Designers wanted her. The elite wanted her at their tables. She moved through parties like a spark. Yet even in that glamour, there was tension beneath her skin. Because modeling for Lee was not the destination. It was a mirror. And she had spent her whole life refusing to be trapped by other people's eyes. She wanted to move behind the camera. That desire wasn't vanity, it was survival. In front of the lens, she was an image people could own. Behind the lens, she could own the world. So when the New York shine began to feel like repetition, Lee made another leap that would change everything. She returned to Paris this time not as a dreamer, but as a woman with a mission. She wasn't going to Paris to be admired. She was going to Paris to become an artist. And there was one man she believed could teach her to do it. Man Ray. Man Ray wasn't just a photographer. He was a symbol of the avant-garde itself, surreal, experimental, worshipped in the circles Lee wanted to conquer. She found his studio and was told he was away. For most people, that would have been the end of the attempt. For Lee Miller, it was the beginning. As if the universe was testing her audacity, she crossed the street, sat in a cafe, and waited. Then he appeared sudden, almost theatrical. She didn't hesitate. She introduced herself with the kind of confidence that makes men either laugh or surrender. "I'm your new student." Man Ray dismissed her. He said he didn't take students. He said he was leaving again. Lee's reply was simple, fearless, and dangerous. "Then I'm coming with you." That one line contains the entire Lee Miller blueprint. She didn't ask. She claimed. She didn't negotiate with closed doors. She walked through them. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, if you could ask Lee Miller one question about fame, love, or war, what would it be? And if you're drawn to untold lives of extraordinary women who refuse to be defined, subscribe now because the next story will be even more unbelievable. What began as a mentorship quickly turned into something far more intense. An affair that blurred the line between muse and maker. Lee became his subject, yes, but she also became his collaborator. And that's what made their relationship explosive. Because Lee learned fast. Too fast. She absorbed technique, composition, darkroom work, the strange surreal manipulations of image and light. She didn't just model. She studied. She experimented. She created. And soon, the question wasn't whether she could match him. The question was whether he could handle her becoming his equal. Their studio became a world of obsession, art, and desire tangled so tightly you couldn't separate them. But the more Lee grew, the more Man Ray's admiration twisted into possessiveness. He wanted to capture her, define her, keep her within the frame he built. And Lee, who had been fighting cages her entire life, could sense the bars forming. Here's the secret that drives her whole story and why viewers can't look away once it starts. Lee Miller didn't fear scandal. She feared confinement. And the moment love began to feel like a cage, she would tear it apart even if the escape cost her everything. Because as much as Paris gave her art, it also gave her the first taste of something darker. The realization that she might be brilliant, and still be reduced to someone's muse unless she fought for her own name. And Lee Miller was about to fight. Man Ray thought he had discovered a rare creature, a woman beautiful enough to be immortalized, bold enough to excite him, and hungry enough to stay under his instruction. In the beginning, Lee Miller played the role the world expected: muse, model, the dazzling American girl who had stepped out of Vogue and into the surrealist dream. But Lee wasn't built to stay anyone's reflection. She was built to become the one holding the light. At first, their relationship felt like a fever. Paris in the late 1920s was a city drunk on reinvention, artists rewriting reality, writers tearing down old morals, cafes buzzing with debate and desire. And inside Man Ray's studio, Lee lived inside that electricity. She learned how to pose like a sculpture and how to watch like a predator. She studied his techniques the way other women studied men's moods, carefully, relentlessly, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she wanted to steal the keys to the kingdom. The darkroom became her sanctuary. There, the world could be bent. Shadows could be sharpened. Beauty could be distorted until it revealed something truer than perfection. In the red glow of the safe light, Lee discovered what her father had hinted at years earlier. Photography wasn't merely an image. It was power. The ability to decide what the world would see and what it would never know existed. And Lee learned fast, frighteningly fast. Soon she wasn't just assisting Man Ray. She was taking on commissions, portraits, advertising jobs, work that made money and built reputation. At first, Man Ray basked in it. It flattered him that his student was brilliant. It reflected well on him. People admired his ability to shape talent. But admiration has a fragile border with fear. Because when a student grows into an equal, the teacher has to face a terrifying question. What happens when she doesn't need you anymore? Man Ray's obsession with Lee deepened into something darker. He photographed her endlessly, her face, her neck, fragments of her body like pieces of a puzzle he needed to solve before she disappeared. He wasn't just capturing beauty. He was trying to possess it. To trap her in art the way he couldn't trap her in life. And Lee could feel it. She had lived too long with men who loved by controlling. Men who wanted devotion, not partnership. Men who confused ownership with intimacy. Lee had promised herself, without even speaking it aloud, that she would never again be contained. Their partnership became a strange war fought with images instead of fists. They worked side by side, so closely that even later, people struggled to separate their contributions. Sometimes Lee would set the scene, adjust the light, frame the shot. Sometimes Man Ray would step in, claim credit, smooth the narrative. Sometimes Lee would take the photograph and Man Ray would sign it. Sometimes the reverse. And the truth, uncomfortable, complicated, was that their work became so intertwined that even they were no longer sure where one ended and the other began. That kind of artistic intimacy can be intoxicating. Can also be suffocating. The tension exploded one day over a photograph of Lee's neck, an image that should have been art, but became a battlefield of ego. They fought about the concept, about ownership, about who invented what. And Man Ray, unable to handle the threat of Lee's independence, did something theatrical and violent. He slashed the photograph and covered it in red paint, then pinned it to the wall like a warning. It wasn't just rage about a picture. It was rage about losing control. Lee watched this and understood something with perfect clarity. Man Ray did not want a free woman beside him. He wanted a brilliant possession. And for Lee, possession was the one thing she could never tolerate. Yet even as the relationship cracked, it produced one of the most famous innovations in surrealist photography, an accident that felt like fate. In the darkroom, Lee switched on the light by mistake, exposing the negatives. It should have ruined them. It should have been a failure. Instead, when they developed the images, something strange happened. The tones reversed, partially black and white, shifting into an eerie glow. The subjects looked otherworldly, as if reality had been peeled back to reveal its ghost underneath. That accident became a technique. Solarization. The effect was hypnotic, dreamlike, and it made their work legendary. But it also created another fight, the same fight that always follows women who invent alongside men. Who deserved credit? The world wanted a simple answer. Man Ray, the genius. Lee Miller, the muse. The narrative was comforting because it kept power where it belonged. Lee refused that narrative. She didn't publicly scream for credit the way some would today, but her presence in that innovation was undeniable. Even Man Ray couldn't fully erase her. And deep down, that may have been what scared him most. He could not turn Lee into a footnote. She was too central. As the months passed, Man Ray's jealousy grew into something exhausting. His letters became desperate. He confessed his love with words that sounded like devotion but carried the bitterness of a cage. He told her she was free, then punished her for using that freedom. He claimed he supported her, then resented every step she took without him. The more he tried to confine her, the more Lee slipped away. Because Lee Miller was becoming something rare, a woman in Paris not just admired, but respected for her eye. Her photographs weren't copies of Man Ray's surrealism, they were her own kind of unsettling. She captured familiar scenes from angles that made them feel strange, as if she was showing you the world you thought you knew, but with the comforting lies removed. Her style carried a cool precision, a modern sharpness, and underneath it, a quiet fury. And while Man Ray clung to her, Lee began to look beyond him. That's when Aziz entered her life, an Egyptian businessman whose presence felt like a new door opening. Aziz wasn't a starving artist or a jealous genius. He was wealthy, worldly, confident. He offered Lee something different: access, glamour, travel, a life that looked stable from a distance. He pursued her with intensity, and Lee, always drawn to intensity, let herself be swept into the affair. For Man Ray, it was a nightmare. Because Aziz wasn't just competition. He represented escape. Man Ray could compete with other artists. He could compete with the bohemian world. But he could not compete with the promise of a new life, a new identity, a new stage. Lee's social circle expanded. She moved through Parisian society with the same ease she once moved through New York. Parties, salons, cafes. A world of whispered names and smoky rooms. She traveled. She worked. Her reputation grew. And with each success, Man Ray's hold weakened. What made Lee dangerous, truly dangerous, was that she didn't just inspire men. She outgrew them. The final break wasn't sudden. It was slow, inevitable, like a rope fraying until it snaps. Lee began taking opportunities that had nothing to do with Man Ray film work, commissions, travel assignments. She stepped into rooms where she wasn't his anything. She was simply Lee Miller, photographer. Man Ray tried to pull her back with guilt, with romance, with threats, with despair. His obsession intensified into self-destruction. He drank more. He wrote more. He swung between pleading and bitterness. The more he suffered, the more Lee realized she had to leave, not only for her own freedom, but for her own survival. Because love like this doesn't end peacefully. It ends like a fire, beautiful from afar, suffocating up close. In 1932, Lee made her decision. She left Paris for New York. But she didn't leave as a model returning home. She left as an artist with teeth. And she did something bold, almost defiant. She opened her own photography studio and branded it with a name that would provoke Man Ray and the entire Parisian circle. She positioned it as the American branch of his school, as if to say, "You may have taught me, but I own what I learned." New York welcomed her. High society lined up. Vogue used her work. Her studio filled with clients who wanted the same thing they always wanted from Lee Miller: beauty, edge, modernity. She photographed them with surgical precision, turning faces into art and art into money. From the outside, it looked like victory. But Lee's victories were never simple. Because success came with exhaustion. With relentless work. With the pressure of managing a business, maintaining a reputation, constantly performing stability when her soul was still restless. She was brilliant, but she was also fragile in ways she hid. Her health wavered. Her mood swung. She partied too hard. She burned through energy like it was disposable. And then something happened that reminded Lee Miller how cruel the world could be when it decided to use you. One of her photographs was used in an advertisement she hadn't agreed to, an intimate product campaign that caused scandal. People whispered. They judged. They reduced her again to her body, her image, her impropriety. Lee was furious, humiliated, and then almost chillingly she did something unexpected. She didn't let it destroy her. She let it harden her. Because the truth was, Lee was done being ashamed. If society wanted to clutch its pearls at her image, let it. She had survived far worse than gossip. And she began to realize that scandal itself could be weaponized, used as a shield. If the world wanted her to be outrageous, she would become outrageous on her own terms. Still, inside, she was unsettled. New York was thrilling, but it was also suffocating in its own way. Her work became more commercial, less experimental. Clients wanted clean beauty, not surreal edges. The very thing that made Lee feel alive, art that disturbed reality, was being squeezed out by business. And Lee Miller, when bored, became dangerous. That restlessness led her back toward the place that had already claimed her once. Paris. Because she believed that if she returned, she could reclaim the part of herself she had left behind: the surrealist fire, the artistic freedom, the sense that life was more than money and society. So Lee set her course for Europe again. But this time, she wasn't running toward a lover. She was running toward herself. And she had no idea that the next chapter of her life would not be defined by fashion or romance at all. It would be defined by war. Lee Miller returned to Europe the way she did everything boldly, as if the world owed her a stage. But Paris was no longer the same city she had once claimed as home. The air felt sharper. The laughter in cafes had an edge of nervousness. The bohemian freedom that once felt endless now carried a strange tension, like a party that refuses to end even though everyone knows something terrible is coming. Lee stepped back into the surrealist world, and it welcomed her like an old fever. She reunited with artists, drifted through studios, and tasted again the intoxicating feeling of being surrounded by minds that treated reality like clay. Yet even this return carried a different tone. Lee had changed. New York had toughened her. Independence had sharpened her. And she was no longer willing to orbit around another man's genius. Still, her past wouldn't release her. Man Ray was never truly gone. Their history clung to them both. He remained obsessed in a way that felt less like love and more like possession that had been denied. Even when Lee was elsewhere, even when she was building her own career, she could feel him circling in the background like a shadow that refused to fade. But Lee's life wasn't moving backward. It was expanding outward. In this new Paris, she fell deeper into her affair with Aziz, an Egyptian businessman who offered her a different kind of security. Aziz didn't treat Lee like a muse. He treated her like a prize, yes, but also like a woman he intended to keep. His wealth opened doors. His connections created a world of dinners, travel, and high society that contrasted sharply with the chaotic intensity of the surrealists. For a while, Lee drifted between these two worlds, Parisian art and cosmopolitan luxury, like she belonged to both. Yet her soul was still restless. Because Lee Miller was not the kind of woman who could settle into someone else's plan, even if that plan glittered. When she returned to New York again, it wasn't because she had failed in Paris. It was because the city demanded her and she could still command attention there. Her studio thrived, but the work began to feel like a cage. The art world wanted her to stay in a neat box, a glamorous photographer, a fashionable success story, a woman who could make beauty look effortless. Lee hated being neat. She was built for chaos. And then, in 1934, she did something that shocked almost everyone who thought they understood her. She married Aziz. It happened fast, almost casually, as if Lee had decided to test what would happen if she chose stability for once. The marriage was unconventional from the start. 2 ceremonies, one civil and one at the Egyptian consulate, shadowed by prejudice and whispers. Aziz was older, foreign, different, and Lee, always drawn to the dramatic, seemed to embrace the scandal of it as much as the man himself. Then she closed her New York studio and moved with him to Egypt. To the outside world, it looked like a retreat, like a surrender. Like the wild, scandalous Lee Miller had finally been tamed by marriage and distance. But anyone who truly understood Lee would have known, she was never tame. She was simply changing the scenery. Egypt was dazzling in its own way, heat shimmering over sand, ancient ruins standing like bones of civilizations, a social world of diplomats and royalty. Lee entered Cairo society like a strange creature from another planet. Blonde, modern, irreverent, refusing to obey the invisible rules that kept women quiet. She played bridge with elites, attended parties, traveled through the region as if she were living inside a painting. And yet, beneath the glamour, Lee was unhappy. Cairo felt like a gilded cage. The city's traditions, its restrictions, its expectations of women pressed against her skin. Lee moved freely compared to many women around her, but even that freedom felt monitored. She began to fall ill more often. Her letters hinted at physical discomfort, aching joints, exhaustion. She felt aged before her time, as if her body carried the weight of every intense chapter she had lived. For months, she hardly touched her camera. It is one of the strangest ironies of Lee Miller's life. The woman who would later become one of the greatest war photographers alive once believed she had come to loathe photography entirely. The part of her that once lived for art went quiet. And in that silence, Lee searched for distractions: nightlife, rebellion, affairs that hinted she still belonged to herself, not to the marriage. But the desert was different. The desert didn't demand she be anything. The desert didn't judge her. And slowly, almost mysteriously, Lee's camera awakened again. She began taking trips into the vast landscapes, photographing ruins and sand and the endless horizon. Her images from Egypt weren't simply travel pictures, they were surreal in their stillness. Empty spaces that looked like dreams. Ancient stones that felt like ghosts. A world where time moved slowly enough for Lee to breathe. That work revived her. But it also reminded her of what she truly loved. Not stability, not society, not marriage, but creative intensity. And then, in 1937, fate placed another man in her path not as a replacement, but as a new kind of mirror.
Roland Penrose.
Roland was a surrealist artist and writer, part of the same bohemian universe Lee had once lived in, but he carried a different energy than Man Ray. Less possessive, less fragile, more grounded in companionship. He admired her work, her mind, her fire. And when he looked at Lee, he didn't see a muse to frame. He saw an equal. Their attraction flared quickly. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't cautious. It was one of those connections that feels inevitable the moment it begins. Lee, starved for a world that understood her, found herself pulled back toward Europe through Roland's gravity. That summer, she traveled again France, the Riviera, circles of artists and lovers, days that blurred into nights. She visited Picasso. She moved through salons where creativity and desire mingled freely. She lived once more in that surrealist haze where rules were treated like suggestions. But when the summer ended, Lee returned to Cairo. And the return felt like punishment. She wrote to Roland with a kind of aching honesty, confessing that her tears bound her like chains. Cairo now seemed suffocating. Her marriage to Aziz began to unravel fully, not in one dramatic explosion, but in the slow erosion of two people realizing they were no longer living the same life. Lee's restlessness turned reckless again. She had affairs. She defied local society. She wandered through Cairo like someone trapped in a beautiful prison, searching for a door that didn't exist. Meanwhile, beyond all of this personal chaos, the world itself was shifting. Europe was darkening. Hitler's power was expanding. Alliances were forming. Fear was spreading like smoke. And as war crept closer, Lee felt something strange inside her, something she hadn't expected. Not fear. A pull. Because Lee Miller had always been drawn to intensity. And nothing in the world was about to be more intense than what was coming. When she finally left Egypt for England in 1939, it was officially a holiday. But in truth, it was an escape. She was leaving one life behind. And she was stepping into the most dangerous chapter she would ever live. Because the woman who once posed for Vogue was about to become something the world had never seen before. A woman with a camera, on the front lines of war. England in 1939 felt like a country holding its breath. Lee Miller arrived with Roland Penrose just as the world began to fracture. The conversations in salons were no longer only about art. They were about borders, invasions, rumors, sirens. The bohemian surrealist world, once obsessed with breaking reality for beauty, was now faced with a reality that was breaking itself. When Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, London shifted overnight. The city that once celebrated fashion and theater became a city of blackout curtains and bomb shelters. Streets that had felt glamorous now felt tense. Every night carried the possibility of fire. And Lee, who had spent her youth chasing freedom, found herself strangely drawn to the threat. Because war, in its brutal honesty, stripped away the artificial. It made everything sharp. It forced people to reveal who they truly were. That kind of intensity was familiar to Lee. She couldn't enlist foreign women, weren't supposed to be part of the official military machine. But Lee didn't accept closed doors. She never had. She found another way in British Vogue. In 1940, she began working for the magazine, photographing fashion and society while the city was under siege. At first, the contrast was surreal luxury and rubble, satin and smoke. Vogue wanted elegance. The country wanted survival. And Lee's camera began to live in the space between the two. She photographed models in gas masks. She photographed fashion staged against the ruins of bombed streets. She captured women still trying to look beautiful even as their city burned. And then the Blitz began. Night after night, German bombers roared overhead. Buildings collapsed. Churches burned. Streets filled with shattered glass and smoke. Lee walked through London with a camera as if she were walking through a dream made of fire. Most people hid. Lee went out. She photographed charred walls, twisted metal, broken homes. She photographed the strange, almost surreal shapes that destruction made like the war itself was creating its own brutal art. The government noticed. Soon, the British Ministry of Information enlisted her to document the devastation for propaganda images meant to awaken American sympathy, to push support, to show the world what Britain was enduring. Her photographs appeared in publications that carried titles like Grim Warnings, because the truth was grim. And Lee's work didn't soften it. It didn't glamorize suffering. It showed endurance. This was the first great transformation in Lee's career. She stopped being a photographer of beauty and became a photographer of resilience. And once she tasted that purpose, fashion began to feel pointless. She started photographing women in wartime roles: factory workers, mechanics, women in uniform, women hauling equipment, operating searchlights in the dead of night. She captured the shift that war forced on society. Women stepping into roles men once claimed, not for liberation, but because survival demanded it. Lee's photos had a specific energy. They didn't pity these women. They respected them. She didn't frame them as victims. She framed them as forces. But Lee wanted more. She could feel it. The hunger that had always driven her, the need to go closer, deeper, further. London, even under bombs, was still behind the lines. She didn't want to photograph the consequences of war from a distance. She wanted to photograph war itself. By 1944, Lee pushed relentlessly for accreditation as a war correspondent. It wasn't easy. The front lines were considered no place for a woman, especially a woman who had once been a model. There were men in uniforms who looked at her and saw a distraction, a scandal, a liability. Lee looked at them and saw obstacles. Finally, she secured official status as British Vogue's war correspondent. And when she crossed into France after the D-Day invasion, she stepped into a world that looked like the end of civilization. Barbed wire, warning signs, broken roads, burned fields, bodies wrapped in bandages, hospitals overflowing with suffering. She didn't flinch. Lee drove through landscapes marked with skull and crossbone signs. She moved through field hospitals where soldiers lay half alive, smoking cigarettes as if smoke could keep their fear from rising. She photographed surgeons working with hands stained by blood. She photographed nurses exhausted beyond words. She photographed men who looked younger than her, their faces already hollowed out by what they'd seen. This wasn't the war the magazines romanticized. This was raw. And Lee Miller was right there, capturing it with a calmness that felt almost unnatural. In August 1944, she reached the city of St. Malo in Brittany as fierce fighting erupted. Snipers hid in towers. Streets turned into killing grounds. Smoke swallowed the sky. Lee stayed with American troops, pushing closer than many male correspondents dared. Her images from St. Malo became historic. She was one of the only women to photograph combat from inside the danger zone. And for that, she was punished. A memo came down from Allied command forbidding female correspondents from the front lines. The message was clear. You can witness war, but only from where we allow you. Stay in your place. Lee ignored it. Because by then, she was no longer the woman who listened to rules. She was the woman who had tasted gunpowder and couldn't go back. When Paris was liberated, Lee returned to the city that had once been her playground. But it wasn't the Paris of cafes and surrealists anymore. It was scarred, bruised, and defiant. Sandbags stood around landmarks. Bullet holes marked walls. People celebrated freedom while grief still clung to them like dust. Lee photographed it all. Women cycling past ruined buildings, barbed wire cutting the skyline, the strange rebirth of fashion as if dresses could declare victory over darkness. Picasso saw her again and barely recognized her. He reportedly said she looked like the first Allied soldier he'd seen, and it was her. The glamorous muse had been replaced by something harder, something older, something forged in war. Paris celebrated. But Lee wasn't done. Because once you've stepped into the heart of destruction, celebration can feel small. Lee moved on to photograph surrendering German soldiers, refugees, the shifting front as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe. She was moving toward something darker, something most people didn't yet understand. The camps. And when Lee Miller finally entered those places designed to erase humanity, her life would change forever. The camera would still click. But what it captured would haunt her for the rest of her days. Because there are images you can never unsee. And once Lee saw them, she would never fully return to the woman she used to be. Lee Miller entered the camps with the same quiet resolve she carried onto battlefields, but nothing had prepared her for what waited there. Until that moment, war had been chaos. Smoke, blood, ruined cities, exhausted soldiers. Brutal, yes, but still framed by movement and resistance. The camps were different. They were still. Silent in a way that screamed. Places where cruelty had been systemized, industrialized, perfected. When Lee walked through the gates, the air itself felt wrong. She photographed survivors whose bodies were barely holding together, eyes too large for faces that had lost all softness. She photographed bunks stacked like shelves for the nearly dead. She photographed piles of clothing, shoes, personal objects, evidence of lives reduced to inventory. And she photographed the perpetrators, too. Guards and officials who tried to blend in, who claimed ignorance, who suddenly looked small and frightened in the presence of truth. Lee did not soften these images. She didn't aestheticize them. She didn't look away. Her photographs from the camps are difficult to look at even now, not because they are sensational, but because they are restrained. She let the horror speak for itself. She understood that to dramatize suffering would be another kind of violence. So she stood there, steady, and let the camera witness. This was no longer about art. This was about proof. About forcing the world to confront what it wanted to forget. Lee carried a flask of brandy with her through these places. Not to dull the horror but to survive it. A small human ritual in landscapes designed to strip humanity away. She drank when the images became too heavy, when the smell of death clung to her clothes, when the silence pressed in too tightly. And still she kept going. From camp to camp, from shattered town to shattered town, Lee documented the collapse of Hitler's empire. In Germany, she photographed entire families who had taken their own lives beneath portraits of the Führer, choosing death over accountability. She photographed civilians who insisted they had known nothing, even as evidence lay around them like rubble. Her anger grew. She wrote bitterly about the denial she encountered, the insistence that no one was responsible, that cruelty had appeared from nowhere. Lee felt rage coil inside her, hot and relentless. She described working herself into fury so intense that she struggled to find kindness even for victims, because the weight of injustice felt unbearable. This is the part of Lee Miller's story people rarely talk about. Not the bravery, the aftermath. Because bearing witness is not heroic in the way movies portray it. It doesn't leave you feeling strong. It leaves you fractured. It rewires your sense of reality. And once you have seen what humans are capable of doing to one another, you don't simply step back into ordinary life. Lee couldn't. In April 1945, she and fellow photographer David Sherman reached Munich. Hitler's private apartment had been captured by Allied forces. It was there, inside the dictator's personal space, that Lee created one of the most infamous images of the war. She took a bath in Hitler's bathtub. Not as a joke. As an act of defiance. She scrubbed herself clean in the very place where the architect of so much suffering had once lived comfortably. Mud from Dachau still on her boots, Lee sat in that tub and allowed herself one moment of symbolic victory. The body that had walked through hell, reclaiming its humanity in the enemy's home. The photograph is unsettling, absurd, powerful. It captures the strange contradictions of war, horror and irony, survival and rage, triumph and trauma tangled together in a single frame. Soon after, she photographed Hitler's mountain retreat as it burned. Flames swallowing luxury, power dissolving into smoke. The war in Europe was ending, but Lee did not feel relief. She felt hollow. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, magazines celebrated victory. Lee's photographs appeared in glossy pages under triumphant headlines. But what she had seen didn't fit neatly into celebration. Her images carried weight, too much weight for easy optimism. The war ended. Lee did not. Inside her, something had broken open and refused to close again. She returned to Paris after the liberation and found the city alive with joy and exhaustion. Cafés reopened. Fashion returned. Music spilled into streets that had known silence for years. And Lee photographed this rebirth. Two women cycling past bullet-scarred buildings, people reclaiming ordinary pleasures like walking and flirting. But the joy felt distant to her. She had crossed a line most people never cross. She had seen humanity stripped to bone. Fashion assignments resumed, but she despised them now. Silk and elegance felt obscene compared to what she had witnessed. She wrote with frustration about the trivialities people complained about now that peace had arrived. After gunfire and camps, boredom felt insulting. Her editors sensed the shift. Vogue wanted glamour. Lee delivered ghosts. Funding was cut. Assignments became more controlled. The magazine gently pushed her away from the raw truth she insisted on showing. Lee didn't fight it. She was too tired. She traveled east, drifting through Europe as if trying to outrun what lived inside her.
Romania.
Rural villages. Strange customs. She photographed peasants, musicians, everyday life continuing stubbornly amid ruins. She was drawn to people who had endured quietly, without spectacle. But even this wandering couldn't silence her inner war. Letters arrived that reopened old wounds. Roland Penrose, the man she loved, confessed to another woman. The betrayal cut deep not because she believed love was permanent, but because after everything she had seen, she had hoped for one anchor. She returned to England. The reunion with Roland was strained, heavy with unspoken truths. They tried to reconnect, but neither was the person they had been before the war. Lee's temper sharpened. Her moods darkened. Alcohol became a companion more constant than people. The post-war world felt unbearably small. She was celebrated as a hero, welcomed as a witness, praised for her courage. But inside, she felt displaced like someone who had survived a catastrophe no one else wanted to acknowledge anymore. And then something unexpected happened. Lee discovered she was pregnant. At nearly 40, after years of war, trauma, and chaos, she was about to become a mother. The news stunned her. It introduced a fragile, terrifying hope, something new growing in a body that had been used, pushed, exhausted, yet still alive. She wrote with raw honesty about the shock, about the fear, about the strange tenderness she felt for the future she hadn't planned. In 1947, Lee and Roland married quietly. Not as a fairy tale ending. As a truce. A decision to try to build something stable after years of instability. When her son was born, Lee held him with a mix of wonder and distance. She loved him, but the war still lived inside her. The images, the smells, the rage, the grief. She could not simply step into motherhood untouched by what she had witnessed. The world saw Lee Miller as a war heroine. What it did not see was the cost. The cost of looking too closely. The cost of remembering too much. And as the years passed, that cost would begin to show in her body, her relationships, and her sense of self. Because surviving history is not the same as surviving yourself. And Lee Miller was about to face the hardest battle of all, living in a world that expected her to forget. After the war, the world wanted Lee Miller to return to something recognizable. They wanted her to smile again, to photograph beauty, to become the woman she had been before destruction rewired her senses. Peace, to everyone else, was a relief. To Lee, it felt like exile. She tried. She really did. She settled with Roland at Farley Farm in Sussex, a quiet stretch of countryside meant to offer healing. The land was open, green, generous, nothing like the ruins she had lived inside for years. On paper, it was the perfect ending. Marriage, a child, safety, distance from war. A woman who had done her part and earned rest. But Lee Miller had never known how to rest. The silence of peace was louder than bombs. At Farley Farm, artists and intellectuals still passed through Picasso, old surrealist friends, ghosts of the world she once belonged to. They came to talk, to reminisce, to drink, to remember when everything had felt possible. Lee hosted them, cooked for them, laughed when expected. From the outside, she looked like a woman surrounded by creativity and love. Inside, she was unraveling. Motherhood did not heal her. It complicated her. She loved her son, But love came tangled with fear, distance, and anger she didn't always understand. Trauma does not disappear when a child arrives, it reshapes itself. Lee struggled with patience, with softness, with the expectation that she should suddenly become gentle simply because she had given birth. She had seen too much to be gentle on command. Roland, for his part, tried to be steady. He loved her. He respected her work. But he did not fully understand the depth of what the war had done to her. And how could he? No one who hadn't walked through camps and battlefields ever truly could. Slowly, Lee's relationship with photography collapsed. She refused assignments. She resisted the camera. The same tool that had once given her control now felt like a trap, a reminder of everything she could never unsee. Editors encouraged her to return. Friends insisted she still mattered. Lee shut the door. That chapter was over. Or so she told herself. In its place, she found another outlet. Cooking. At first, it seemed harmless. Even charming. Lee threw herself into the kitchen with the same intensity she once brought to art. Recipes became experiments. Meals became performances. She treated ingredients like compositions, turning food into something surreal, extravagant, unforgettable. Guests were astonished. Some said she cooked the way she photographed, bold, unafraid, deeply personal. Cooking gave her something photography no longer could. It kept her present. It filled her hands. It quieted her mind, at least temporarily. But even that refuge couldn't hold back what was building inside her. Lee drank heavily. Alcohol became a companion that dulled the sharp edges of memory. Her mood swung unpredictably. Rage appeared without warning. Depression settled like fog. Those closest to her learned to brace themselves. Her marriage suffered. Roland, once her anchor, drifted. Affairs crept in, not always hidden, not always denied. Lee, exhausted and emotionally distant, sometimes allowed it, believing that loosening the rules might keep the structure intact. It didn't. It only hollowed it out further. At times, Lee seemed to vanish inside her own home. She withdrew. She isolated. She turned inward, fighting battles no one else could see. Her son, growing up in the shadow of a legendary mother, felt the weight of her volatility. Later, he would write about the confusion of loving someone who could be brilliant one moment and unreachable the next. Lee was not cruel by design. She was wounded beyond language. This is the part of her story that rarely gets celebrated. It doesn't fit the heroic arc. It doesn't flatter the myth. But it is essential. Because bravery does not guarantee peace. And survival does not promise happiness. Lee Miller had lived at extremes: fame and anonymity, beauty and horror, control and chaos. The post-war world offered something she didn't know how to accept: ordinary time. Days without urgency. Life without a mission. And without a mission, Lee felt unmoored. Her health declined. Doctors offered shallow advice: rest, distraction, moderation. None of it touched the real wound. Today, we would recognize the symptoms immediately: post-traumatic stress, depression, unresolved trauma. Back then, it was simply labeled difficult, unstable, excessive. Lee internalized the blame. She believed she had failed at peace. As years passed, her public presence faded. She was no longer the war correspondent, no longer the muse, no longer the rising photographer. She became, in the eyes of many, Roland's wife. A footnote. A former brilliance dimmed by time. That invisibility hurt more than criticism ever had. Yet even in her darkest years, Lee did not completely disappear. She still created quietly, privately. She documented life at the farm. She hosted salons that pulsed with memory and art. She preserved the past even as she tried to bury parts of it. Occasionally, someone would rediscover her work and marvel at its power. Exhibitions resurfaced. Praise trickled back. But it arrived too late to undo the damage. Lee did not crave validation anymore. She craved relief. Loss continued to follow her. Her parents aged and died. Old friends vanished one by one. The surrealist world that had once defined her dissolved into history books and museum walls. The men she had loved, Man Ray, Picasso, others became legends. And Lee, who had been central to their stories, was often mentioned only in passing. That erasure cut deep. Because Lee had never wanted to be remembered as someone's shadow. She had fought her entire life to be the one holding the lens. By the early 1970s, illness entered her body like a final siege. Cancer. Weakness. Fatigue. Her world narrowed to rooms, memories, small routines. Roland stayed close. So did her son, now grown, attempting reconciliation with the woman who had frightened and fascinated him his entire life. In her final years, something softened. Not happiness but clarity. Lee began to speak more honestly about her past. About the war. About the rage. About the exhaustion of carrying history alone. She did not regret what she had done. She regretted only that the cost had been so high. When death came in 1977, it was quiet.
No cameras. No crowds.
Just the end of a life that had burned hotter than most. Her ashes were scattered across Farley Farm into the land she had tended, cooked from, walked through in silence. The place where she had tried, in her own fractured way, to make peace with the world. Lee Miller did not die as a celebrity. She died as a survivor. And the world, for a long time, did not know what to do with that truth. But history has a way of circling back. And Lee Miller's story was not finished yet. Because sometimes, it takes decades for the world to understand the women who refuse to be simple. 4 years after Lee Miller's death, her story lived in fragments. A Vogue cover here. A Man Ray photograph there. The famous bathtub image in Hitler's apartment passed around like a strange piece of wartime trivia. People remembered her as a face, a muse, a scandal, a surrealist lover, a bold correspondent. They remembered the most cinematic pieces because cinematic pieces are easy to package. But the full truth of Lee Miller was buried. Not only by history, by Lee herself. Because when Lee returned from war, she didn't just stop photographing professionally, she tried to shut the door on the entire identity. She hid negatives. She stored prints away. She kept boxes sealed like coffins. The woman who had spent years forcing the world to look at truth now refused to look at her own work again. That alone tells you how deep the war had cut her. It wasn't modesty. It was self-protection. When trauma becomes your daily language, memories turn dangerous. And Lee's photographs weren't just memories. They were proof of things no human being should have to carry. So she tried to bury them under cooking, under farm life, under routine, under alcohol, under silence. She tried to become a different woman, as if reinvention could erase what she had witnessed. But a life like hers does not stay buried forever. Because Lee's work was too important, too historically powerful, too artistically advanced. And the turning point came from an unlikely place, her own son. Anthony Penrose grew up with a mother who was brilliant and difficult, loving and distant, warm and sharp in the same breath. He grew up knowing she was someone, but never fully knowing who. At Farley Farm, he watched adults treat her with a strange mixture of reverence and caution, as if they sensed there was a storm inside her they didn't dare disturb. He also grew up around those boxes. The sealed archives of Lee Miller's life. After Lee died, Anthony began sorting through her belongings, expecting ordinary family keepsakes. But what he found was astonishing: thousands of negatives, contact sheets, prints, documents, letters. A hidden empire of images that proved his mother had not been a footnote in anyone's story. She had been a central witness to the 20th century. And she had been far more than the world knew. As he dug deeper, Anthony realized something unsettling and deeply moving. Lee had left behind a record that was not only valuable but necessary. Her war photographs weren't just images. They were testimony. Her surrealist work wasn't just experimental. It was pioneering. Her collaborations weren't just supportive. They were foundational. In other words, Lee Miller had been erased in plain sight. Not because she lacked talent. Because the world didn't know how to hold a woman who was both beautiful and brilliant, both muse and maker, both fragile and fearless. History prefers categories. Lee refused them. And so history, at least for a time, simplified her. Anthony refused to let that stand. He began bringing Lee's work into the light. carefully, methodically, like restoring a damaged masterpiece. Exhibitions began. Articles were written. Curators studied her. The world slowly realized what had been hidden behind the myth. Lee Miller was not merely a model who became a photographer. She was one of the most significant female photographers of the 20th century. And the more people studied her work, the more they saw how rare her eye truly was. Her surrealism wasn't imitation, it was sharp and modern, grounded in reality but twisted at the edges. Her fashion work carried intelligence, not just glamour. And her war photography. It was extraordinary not because it was sensational, but because it was humane. Lee did not photograph war like a man proving bravery. She photographed war like a woman dissecting truth. She captured the emotional cost, the exhaustion in eyes, the fragility of bodies, the quiet moments between explosions where humanity leaked out. She documented not only destruction but survival. And when she photographed the camps, she did it with restraint and dignity that forced viewers to confront horror without turning it into spectacle. That approach changed how people understood war imagery. It made Lee's work timeless. But as her legacy grew, another truth became harder to ignore. Lee's collapse after the war was not personal weakness. It was the predictable outcome of what she had endured. Today, we have language for it. PTSD, depression, trauma response, survivor's guilt. We know that witnessing mass death reshapes the brain. We know that war can follow you long after the fighting stops. We know that the human mind can fracture under unbearable images. Lee lived through that without the vocabulary, without therapy, without understanding, and without the support systems that exist now. She was told to move on. She couldn't. And that inability wasn't failure. It was evidence of her humanity. If anything, Lee's later life makes her story more powerful. Because it shows the full cost of courage. It shows that bravery isn't a neat, heroic arc. Sometimes bravery is simply walking into horror and surviving long enough to tell the truth. Even if telling that truth destroys parts of you. And then there is her contradiction, the contradiction that makes her story addictive, impossible to forget. Lee Miller lived as a woman who refused to be defined, yet she spent her later life feeling erased. She fought for freedom, yet she ended up trapped inside memory. She captured history with a camera, yet she couldn't bear to look at her own images afterward. She was the face of Vogue, yet she chose to disappear into countryside silence. She was fearless on battlefields, yet she could not win the quieter war inside her. That is the paradox of Lee Miller. She was not designed for simple endings. And perhaps that is why her story resonates so deeply, especially now. Because we live in a world obsessed with empowerment stories that skip the messy parts. We want women to be strong and inspiring and unbreakable. Lee Miller reminds us that strength is not the absence of breaking. Strength is continuing, even broken. Her rediscovery also forces us to confront something uncomfortable. How many women have been reduced to muses when they were creators? How many women were erased because their lives were too complicated, too sexual, too angry, too independent? How many were remembered only for who they loved rather than what they made? Lee was one of them. And yet she survived that erasure. Because her work remained. Because truth remains. And because, in the end, Lee Miller's greatest victory wasn't fame, or marriage, or artistic circles. It was the photographs. The images that outlived her silence. The images that still speak when the myths fade. And as the world finally recognized her not as Man Ray's muse, not as Vogue's cover girl, not as a scandalous woman in Paris, but as Lee Miller, artist and witness, her story took on its final shape. A shape that brings us to the last haunting question, the one that hangs over her life like a shadow in the darkroom light. Did Lee Miller save the world by showing it truth? Or did showing truth destroy the part of her that needed saving most? Lee Miller's life does not end in a neat moral lesson. It ends the way it was lived, bold, contradictory, and impossible to reduce into something comfortable. And that is exactly why she still matters. Because when you strip away the myths, when you stop calling her Man Ray's muse, when you stop turning her into a glamorous headline, when you stop treating her like a beautiful curiosity, you are left with something far more powerful. A woman who forced the world to look. Lee Miller didn't just photograph history. She rewired how history could be seen. Before her, war photography was often framed through a certain kind of masculine bravado battlefield heroism, explosions, soldiers as symbols. Lee brought something different to the lens. Emotional truth. The human cost. The stillness after violence. The faces that didn't fit propaganda. She understood that war wasn't only fought with guns, it was fought inside people's bodies, inside their eyes, inside their memories. And she had the courage to capture that. But the greatest cruelty of Lee Miller's story is that the very gift that made her extraordinary also destroyed her peace. When she returned from war, she carried images inside her mind that no amount of countryside silence could erase. She tried to bury that world under cooking, under routines, under a farm that looked like a sanctuary. Yet trauma does not disappear because you move to a prettier place. It follows you. It seeps into your marriage, your motherhood, your friendships, your health. It turns ordinary moments into battlefields. And Lee, who had been fearless in the face of bullets, found herself terrified of the quiet. That isn't weakness. That is reality. We celebrate witnesses, but we rarely talk about what witnessing costs. Lee's life forces us to confront the price of courage without romanticizing it. She reminds us that the strongest women are not the ones who never break. They are the ones who keep going even when they do. For decades, Lee Miller's true legacy almost disappeared into someone else's shadow. Her work was scattered, hidden, dismissed, misunderstood. She was remembered more for beauty than for brilliance. More for love affairs than for genius. More for scandals than for her camera. And that is a familiar story, isn't it? So many women are reduced to the men around them. So many women are remembered as muses because the world is uncomfortable admitting they were creators. Lee Miller lived inside that injustice, even while she was shaping the art of her time. But in the end, history corrected itself. Because her photographs could not be ignored forever. When Anthony Penrose uncovered her archive, it wasn't merely a son rediscovering his mother. It was the world rediscovering a truth it had misplaced. Exhibitions, books, documentaries, museums slowly, Lee's name returned to where it belonged. Not in the margins of surrealism or fashion, but in the center of 20th century photography. Her images became evidence. Not only of war, but of her own brilliance. And once those images were seen again, Lee Miller could no longer be simplified. The world had to confront the full contradiction. A woman who was once paid to be looked at became the one who made the world look. A woman who once represented glamour became a witness to humanity's darkest depths. A woman who lived for freedom was haunted by the price of it. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of her story. Because Lee Miller's life raises a question that still stings today. What happens when a woman refuses to be defined? She becomes dangerous. Not because she harms others, but because she breaks the rules of how women are supposed to exist. Lee refused to be one thing. She refused to be only beautiful, only talented, only respectable, only maternal, only gentle. She was many things at once: model, artist, survivor, correspondent, cook, mother, lover, rebel. She was human. And the world has always struggled to forgive women for being fully human. Even now, when we celebrate her, we often celebrate the parts that feel dramatic: the Vogue cover, the surrealist affair, the bath in Hitler's tub. Those moments are cinematic. They are easy to remember. But Lee's true legacy is quieter and more profound. She made truth visible. And that matters more than myth. Because in a world where cruelty often hides behind silence, we need witnesses. We need people brave enough to show us what we would rather not see. Lee Miller's camera did not just document horror, it fought against denial. It fought against forgetting. It fought against the idea that history can be rewritten into something cleaner than it truly was. She gave us proof. And proof is a form of justice. So when you look at Lee Miller's life, don't just see the tragedy of her later years. See the magnitude of what she accomplished. See the impossible path she walked. See the woman who stepped into fire and came out carrying images that would outlive her. She was not perfect. She was not peaceful. But she was unforgettable. And maybe that is the only kind of immortality available to someone who lived as fiercely as she did. If you enjoyed this story, Tell me in the comments. Do you think Lee Miller was more haunted by her past? Or more haunted by the world's refusal to truly understand her? And which woman should we uncover next, a forgotten rebel, a queen, a spy, or an icon the world tried to erase? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more untold stories of extraordinary women, and share this episode with someone who loves history, mystery, and powerful true stories. As always, thanks for watching.